Hello and welcome to AP Macroeconomics. I'm Mr. Sanabria and today is exchange rate determinants. So what we're doing is we're looking at the things that shift the supply and the demand for currencies. So let's talk real briefly about the word determinants just in case we're not as familiar with determinants as we should be. What a determinant is something that actually changes the position of a curve on a graph, right? So a supply determinant is something that changes supply, meaning it shifts supply. And a demand determinant is something that shifts demand, okay? So it's going to determine the location of a curve on a graph. So that's what a determinant is. And so exchange rate determinants are specifically those things that determine the supply and or the demand of currencies on a market between two currencies, so a foreign exchange market. So that's what today's topic is. Real quick, before we get into that, let's briefly review what we talked about last time, which was graphing FOREX to begin with, and the two rules we have for shifts in supply and demand of currencies. So, the first thing is, to graph FOREX, you want to do this. Okay, this is a graph of the dollar market versus the euro. So, the graph itself is labeled at the top with the currency that this is the graph for. It is a supply and demand graph, so we have price and quantity, but we recognize that the price of the currency is the exchange rate, as shown by a small e. The quantity is the quantity of dollars in the dollar-euro market. And we've added an exchange rate written mathematically, which is the other currency, in this case we're using euros, over the currency for the graph. So remember, if I'm graphing dollars, then dollars is on the denominator here. And then we've got a pretty typical X in the middle, the supply and demand curves. So that's what you need to show if you are asked to graph the dollar-euro market or the market between any two currencies. But what we know is that when we graph these, we're going to show both graphs. We're going to show both the dollar and the euro graph. And so this is how I would like yours to actually be seen. Now, if you were asked to graph the dollar market on, say, a free response question, the only thing that actually gets graded is your graph of the dollar market. So the fact that the euro market is here is extra, but it's going to help us in doing the work that we need to do, which is shifting supply and demand in this market on both graphs and determining which currency appreciates and which currency depreciates. And so if we want to determine appreciation and depreciation, which is a change in exchange rate, then what we need to do is follow the two rules. And the two rules are, we are going to shift the opposite curves, meaning if I shift demand on one graph, I shift supply on the other. And the second rule is that both curves are going to shift in the same direction. So if I shift supply on one graph to the right, then I shift demand on the other curve, on the other graph to the right. Okay, and it ends up looking a little bit like this. Alright, so on this graph, what I've got is the demand for dollars for some reason went up. And so I shifted demand to the right on the dollar graph. And because I followed the two rules, that means I shift supply to the right on the euro graph. And the result is, and I have these nice dotted lines and arrows to show this result, is that the dollar appreciated because we have a new equilibrium that is at a higher exchange rate. And the euro depreciated because we have a new equilibrium that is at a lower exchange rate. And so we've determined that the dollar appreciates and the euro depreciates. And when you do your graphing, I would love to see these dotted lines that connect our equilibriums to the exchange rate. Okay? And it also helps if you draw an arrow showing the movement of the change and you write an appreciation and depreciation. All of that is very good because it makes for clear graphing. And what the question is probably asking you in the first place is to show the effect on the exchange rate. And by drawing this arrow, I have actually shown the effect on the exchange rate. So now, today is all about figuring out why demand would have shifted to the right in the first place. Okay, that's a determinant. A determinant is a thing that makes that change happen. Okay, so some change in a determinant determines the location. It causes a change, or it's the reason for a change. So if you recall, when we learned first about supply and demand determinants, we had that TRIPE and NICE-JAG, those acronyms, right? And I told you, don't worry so much about remembering these individual determinants. I want you to think about this conceptually. And that was true of just regular supply and demand, that behavioral change versus a price change, right? But with this, there's only 4, and I do want you to memorize these as they come. You do need to know these 4 determinants of Forex. So let's go ahead and get started. The first determinant is consumer tastes. All this is saying, and this is our simplest determinant, if suddenly people in the United States like to buy something that's made in Europe more than they did before, they're going to increase the demand for those products, right? So let's say that these are, English made OXO products. That's an English company, okay, for kitchenware. So if people in the United States suddenly prefer more OXO products in their kitchen, they're going to want to buy more of these products. And in order to buy that product, they first have to demand more English currencies, right? English pounds. And so what you end up having is a shift to the right, an increase in the demand for the English pound, which of course means there's going to be an increase in the supply of dollars. And in that case, the pound would appreciate and the dollar would depreciate. So this is a very straightforward relationship. And what we're going to find with all of these is that whichever country has the desirable thing, their currency, the demand for it increases. Okay? So the demand for that currency, whichever country has the desirable thing going on, is going to increase. And the supply of the other country will increase. And that's going to cause that appreciation and depreciation. This, importantly, is the reason why I have you draw both graphs. Because it's generally very easy for us to think about changes in terms of who's demanding more. Because if you draw both graphs, it's true that you can always increase demand on whichever graph is appropriate, and then look at which graph the question is asking about. So I can always pick out demand because it just seems more natural. So in my case, I could have asked you what happens to the US dollar if people in the US prefer British goods. Well, you could think of it in terms of, well, Americans will have to supply more dollars to the market. And that's true, right? Because we already talked about how supply would increase in that example. But it might be easier or more intuitive for you to think, well, if people like British goods, then they're going to demand more pounds. And so whichever way it works in your mind, if you have both graphs, you're going to get to do the thing that makes sense to you. And for most of us, that is thinking about whose thing is being demanded, whose currency is going to be demanded. So I've given an example here. If there's a preference for Japanese goods, that creates an increase in the supply of dollars in the currency exchange market, which leads to depreciation of the dollar and appreciation of the yen. If it helps you, perhaps you should draw the graphs for each of these examples as I go through them. That would be good practice. Relative income. This is our next determinant. I told you there were 4 of these, right? So relative income is our second one. And what this is saying is that if one country is doing better economically than another, then they are going to have more money to spend on the other country's goods. Okay? So let's look at an example of this. And I'll go ahead and move myself out of the way. If Mexico's economy is strong and the U.S. economy is in a recession, then Mexicans will buy more American goods, increasing the demand for the dollar, causing the dollar to appreciate and the peso to depreciate. So let's be careful and look at what really just happened here. It's Mexico's economy that was doing well, and that drove up demand for American goods, which were not doing as well. And the other thing that's important here is that these are relative changes. What this example does not say is that Mexico's economy is stronger, apples to apples, than the U.S. economy. It just means that the U.S. economy and the Mexican economy, there's been a change in the status quo. The Mexican economy has increased in strength relative to the U.S. economy. And so there is an increase in spending by Mexican citizens on U.S. goods, meaning they first have to convert more Mexican pesos into U.S. dollars. Demand for the dollar goes up. So go ahead and graph that one in your notes. Now, these next two are the big ones that you're going to see time and time again. Now we're getting into relative price level, which is a little bit more complicated. And what we have to first discuss today is what a change in price level means. And what a change in price level is a general change in the prices across the entire economy. And we're going to talk a lot about this semester, and this is the first time you're seeing it. But what I want you to do is recognize that this is talking about inflation, right? Inflation is the idea that prices are constantly going up across the entire economy, which also is the same thing as saying that the value of the dollar is going down. But the value of the dollar is not going down in this case relative to the other currency. With a change in price level, it means the value of the dollar is changing relative to itself in terms of what it used to be worth. So $1 today won't buy you as much as $1 tomorrow. Okay, so that's a value change in a dollar, but that's different than the value change we're talking about in terms of appreciation or depreciation. So I want you to keep those concepts separately and understand that the dollar can depreciate, which means it's lost value against some other currency, or the dollar can experience inflation, which means that it is experiencing a decrease in value based on what it used to be worth compared to itself. Could be a little tricky. If you need to replay that explanation and think about it, go ahead and do that. But I'm going to move on and discuss how this value change, how inflation in one country is going to affect the exchange rate determinant. Hey, just wanted to jump in here and give a little visual to what we're talking about with this idea of two different ways that the value of money can change. So right here I've got my whiteboard labeled changes in the value of money. And in case you don't know already, and we're going to be doing this a lot, that is a delta symbol. It's just a triangle, and it stands for change. So we're going to use that as a symbol a lot in this course. So if we see a delta sign or a triangle, that means a change. So this is changes in the value of money. We've got two different ways that we can think about the value of money changing. One is inflation, and inflation means that the value of money is going down over time relative to itself. The other way is depreciation. Depreciation means that the value of money has gone down in relationship to some other currency. So let's just go ahead and work through an example for each so that hopefully maybe the difference is a little more clear. Okay, so what I've got here is a pizza, and the pizza costs $10. Well, if inflation occurred in the United States, well then what that would mean is that the price of pizza would go up. So let's see what that would look like. Pizza is now $12. Okay, so the price of pizza went up from $10 to $12, which in terms of value, and this is the thing we need to really be able to think about, the value of the dollar actually went down. See, 10 of these things called dollars used to be able to get me a whole pizza. Now 10 of these things called dollars won't get me a whole pizza. I need to find $2 more if I want the same amount of stuff. The value of the dollar has gone down. Well, what would be the case if we looked at this from a depreciation standpoint? Something that's totally different. Here we are. If €1 equals $1, then we have an exchange rate of 1-to-1. It couldn't get much simpler than that. So how many euros would it take to buy a pizza? Well, it would take first 10 euros to buy $10, and then you use the $10 to buy the pizza, right? So that seems pretty simple. What would happen if the dollar depreciated, meaning now the dollar is going to lose value against the euro? Okay, so here we are. Now there has been a depreciation event, and we don't care why, but the point is that for every €1, I can get $2 now. The first thing we got to recognize is that the dollar actually depreciated. I know there's a bigger number there, but we got to think through this, and it's helpful to think of it in terms of a narrative. Yesterday, I had €1, and I could spend it on $1, and I could get $1. Now I've got €1, and I can spend it on dollars, and I can get $2. That means the euro is now more valuable than the dollar, right? The euro has appreciated and the dollar has depreciated. Now let's bring this thing full circle. Let's say that I want to use euros to buy a pizza. Well, the first thing I have to do is convert my euros into $10 worth, right? Well, now it's only going to take me 5 euros to buy that pizza. That's the point, and that's a pretty key difference. So let's get back to the conversation about Forex. Now for our example on relative price level. If the price is higher in Canada than in the United States, then American goods are relatively cheaper than Canadian goods. Thus, Canadians will import more American goods, causing the US dollar to appreciate and the Canadian dollar to depreciate. So let's break that down real quick and make sure we understand what's happening. This example is focusing on the imports and exports side of things, not the investor side of things, but they're both equally part of the conversation. So let's talk about this example. The price level is higher in Canada than in the US. So Canada is experiencing inflation relative to the US. Okay, so Canada has the inflation. No one likes inflation. So what ends up happening is American goods are relatively cheaper than Canadian goods. The price tag on all the Canadian stuff went up. And so Americans are just going to buy fewer of them. And that's going to cause a decrease in the demand for Canadian goods, right? The other thing that's going on, at the same time that Americans are buying fewer of the more expensive Canadian goods, people in Canada are looking around and realizing that prices have gone up for Canadian-made stuff. Let's import stuff from the United States because guess what? Their prices haven't gone up. And so this is working from both sides. Okay, if you're experiencing inflation, your stuff is too expensive and people buy less of it. And that's a pretty simple relationship. Last thing here, speculation. All right, what I'm talking about is investors. And these are just people all over the world who have money and they're looking for a place to invest it. And when you invest money, what you're looking for is a return on that investment. So you're going to buy some sort of a financial product, and you're going to get money in return. I think maybe we're pretty familiar with what the idea of investing is. Well, here's the thing. The thing that you're actually talking about buying when you want to invest your money, especially if you're going to invest your money in a different country, which is what we're really talking about. We're talking about foreign investment here. If I'm going to invest my money in a foreign country, the thing I'm actually buying is a bond from that country. So let's say that I wanted to invest in China. What I would do is I would look for Chinese bonds. Okay, this is one thing that I could look at. So I'm investing in the country itself. So I want to invest in Chinese bonds. And what a bond is a bond is an IOU, right? I owe you money. That's what an IOU is, in case you're not familiar with that term. But what a bond is saying is that if I'm China and you buy a bond from me for $100, sometime in the future, maybe 10 years from now, I'm going to give you back your $100, and I'm going to give you interest as well. $100 plus interest. Okay? And so, guess what? That plus interest, that's my profit. That's my return on investment. So thinking about it that way, do I want to buy a bond from someone who's offering me high interest or low interest? Time's up. The answer is I want to buy bonds from people who are willing to pay me a higher interest rate. And so this idea of speculation, I really want you to think of it in terms of interest rates. Okay? Interest rates are a determinant of Forex. The higher the interest rate, the more foreign investment is attracted. So if more foreign investors come looking to invest, meaning come looking to buy bonds, then they're going to demand more currency. Because if you're going to buy a bond from me, you need to pay me in my own money, right? So going back to this example of I want to invest in China. Well, if China offers a higher interest rate, then more people are going to want to invest in China. More people will first convert their dollars into Chinese yuan and then use that yuan to buy bonds. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the example. If U.S. investors expect that Swiss interest rates will climb in the future, then Americans will demand Swiss francs in order to earn higher rates of return in Switzerland. This causes the dollar to depreciate and the Swiss franc to appreciate. Why? Because the demand for Swiss francs increased. Okay? So a higher interest rate is a good thing for demand for that currency in the foreign exchange markets. But here's the tricky thing. Generally speaking, domestically, and by domestically I mean here in this country, we don't want high interest rates. High interest rates are a drag on the economy. And that's the confusing thing about thinking of interest rates here. So what an interest rate is, it's the return on an investment if the investment is a bond, right? But it's also should be thought of as the cost of borrowing money. You see, that bond isn't really something you buy. We think of it in terms of buying bonds. But really what you're doing, and what's maybe more useful to think about, is if you buy a bond from China, what you're doing is loaning money to China. It's a loan. So buying bonds is actually making a loan. Well, what's a loan? You let somebody borrow some money for a certain amount of time, and when they pay you back, they give you a little bit extra, and that's interest. I've just described a bond, haven't I? I give China $100. 10 years later, they give me my $100 back, and they give me some interest. So interest rates are both the profit from lending and the cost of borrowing. It just depends on who you are. Are you the one borrowing, or are you the one lending? See, in the Forex markets, we're talking about attracting foreign investment. But here at home, high interest rates aren't a good thing because it makes us pay more when we borrow money. So when I said before that, hey, inflation's bad and no one likes it, and so you can always think of whoever has the higher price level, they're going to experience a decrease in demand for their currency. Inflation's a little trickier because foreign investors like high interest rates, but domestically we don't like high interest rates. So keep that in mind. And that's all I've got on your determinants, okay? There's only 4 determinants, and you really need to know them, and what you really want to concentrate on is this idea of price level inflation and interest rate changes, okay? If interest rates go down, then less people will demand the currency. If interest rates go up, more people will demand the currency because we're talking about foreign investors. The last thing that we need to know about the Forex markets is its effect on exports and imports, and this could not be more important. I am stomping my foot right now, but you can't see it, okay? I need you to know this. This is where it's always going. The reason that we are really talking about Forex is because we want to tie a change in the value of a currency, appreciation and depreciation that is, to some change in imports and exports. So what you need to know is this, that the exchange rate itself is a determinant of both exports and imports. Okay? The exchange rate itself is a determinant of imports and exports. Appreciation of the dollar causes American goods to be relatively more expensive and foreign goods to be relatively cheaper. And that reduces exports and increases imports. So this is different than inflation. It sounds a lot like it, but it's very different. Okay? We're talking about after the fact. Something happened. Maybe it was inflation. I don't know. But something happened that caused appreciation or depreciation. In this case, it's appreciation. That's done. That part's done. Now we're left with appreciation. Well, what does that appreciation mean? That appreciation means that our stuff is now more expensive because you've got to convert more, you've got to convert the same amount of currency because our prices haven't changed. It's just more expensive for you to purchase those dollars now because they're worth more. And if it's more expensive for you to purchase those dollars, it costs you more to convert that money, and so you're going to demand fewer U.S. exports. Depreciation has the opposite effect. Okay? Depreciation of the dollar causes American goods to be relatively cheaper and foreign goods to be relatively more expensive, thus increasing exports and reducing imports. So we really need to know that. That's the end goal. That's the reason this is important. Because if our currency appreciates, then our stuff is now relatively more expensive and people won't buy it as much. And so that's going to cause exports to go down and it's going to cause imports to go up. because now, hey, on the import side of things, if our currency appreciated, well, it's now relatively less expensive for us to buy foreign goods. So that increases our imports at the same time that exports are decreasing. Okay, so we just finished talking about the four determinants of Forex, or supply and demand of currencies on the foreign exchange markets. And then we talked about the link between appreciation and depreciation and an increase and decrease in imports and exports. And imports and exports, when we talk about them together, we call that net exports. Okay, so what that relationship looks like is if appreciation occurs, then net exports decreases. And if depreciation occurs, then net exports increases. So now what I want to do is I want to wrap this whole topic up into what I call the 4 steps of Forex questions. And these are linear steps, meaning you go through them 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you're already at step 3, there's no need to go back and do step 2. Okay, so step 1 is graph the status quo. What I mean by graph the status quo is that you have started off with your 2 properly labeled Forex graphs, and they're just sitting right there at a random equilibrium right in the middle. Nothing shifted yet. So step 2 is show the change on the graphs. That's when you're going to shift the graphs around. Step 2, show the change and determine appreciation or depreciation. And if you can see, I went ahead and shifted some curves there on the first step graphs there. What you're seeing here is that first I started off by drawing out the foreign exchange graphs for the currencies I'm talking about. Then I read the prompt or I look at the question, whatever's being asked, I determine which determinant of Forex is being used, and I figure out which currency needs to have an increase in or decrease in demand, and in which one has an increase or decrease in supply. I'm following the 2 rules and all of that. And I end up knowing that one currency appreciated and the other depreciated. Step 3 is to use appreciation or depreciation to answer the question about what happens to net exports. Okay, so there it is. Step 3, use appreciation or depreciation to determine the change in net exports, which the symbol for net exports is X with a subscript of N. Okay, and we talked about that. If appreciation happened, then net exports decreased. If depreciation happened, then net exports increased. And you can see that I didn't leave room for step 4. That's in fact because we don't know enough yet about macroeconomics to apply step 4. So we're going to come back to our 4-step process in the future. So for you, for right now, it's only 3 steps. Step 1, draw the graphs correctly, side by side. Step 2, correctly identify which of the 4 determinants, and it's usually going to be one of those change in price level, the inflation one, or it's going to be a change in interest rates. Okay, identify that determinant, shift the proper supply and demand on your graphs following the 2 rules, and then you end up with appreciation of one currency, depreciation of the other. You're probably then going to be asked about net exports, and if they say, hey, what happened based on your appreciation of the dollar, what will happen to U.S. net exports, you would say, well, if the dollar appreciated, then net exports went down. And then you're going to do something with that bit of information in the future, but not today. So until then, happy studying.